Garza, and I'm a water, industrials, and infrastructure analyst, as well as co-manager of our 3 utilities funds at Gabelli. Joining us in the second half of that hour will be my colleague Max Sykes to discuss Berkshire Hathaway in depth with Chris Bloomstrand. For those who are new to us, welcome. This is the virtual version of the annual event we host in conjunction with the Berkshire Annual Meeting in Omaha. This would have been our 14th annual Omaha field trip, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you all in person again next year. In the first half hour, we hope to highlight how significant the underinvestment in the U.S.'s infrastructure has been and where we stand with utilizing a ramp up on investment as a policy tool for putting the economy back on its feet, not only in the short term, but also for generations to come. To that end, we have 2 experts on infrastructure. Norm Anderson, founder and CEO of CGLA Infrastructure, which is a consultancy based in DC focused on infrastructure, as well as Tim Hassinger, president and CEO of Lindsay Corporation. Tim joined Lindsay in October of 2017 after a long career at Dow AgroSciences. Lindsay has a $950 million market cap and trades under the ticker symbol LNN. Rather than me going into specifics of their companies, I thought I would allow them to discuss what each individual does, individually the company does, and then we'll go into the questions. Please feel free to type in questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them towards the end of the 30 minutes, and we'll go through them at the end. Thank you. With that, Norm, would you mind kicking it off?
Sure. Good morning. How are you all? Or good afternoon. Nice to be here. Listen, we focus on infrastructure, and we've been focused for some time on how to figure out how to double the level of infrastructure investment in the U.S. My company's a small company. We're in Washington. I'm right across the street from the Treasury. And we'll talk a little bit later about what the U.S. market looks like, and we'll talk as well about what the prospects are for a stimulus and what that should look like. So anyway, that's how I wanted to get things going with you, Jose. I'll turn it over to Tim now, I think.
Well, thanks. And I have the unique thing to be able to say is I live in Omaha, and I can see the CHI Center from my window. So and nobody showed up for the outing there. But no, Lindsay is a company with roughly 500 million US dollars sales. As Jose said, a market cap that ranges between 950 and to $1 billion here over the last, say, 30 days. There's 2 key markets that, 2 key reporting segments, I should say, which is our agriculture, irrigation, and then infrastructure.
Perfect. So before we get into the infrastructure discussion, I thought it would be good to kind of discuss how a CEO of a public company with nearly 1,100 employees is reacting in the current environment. So, Tim, if you wouldn't mind just talking through us about some of your key learnings, kind of navigating the current situation created by COVID-19.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing from my perspective is there were 3 things that we needed to do quickly. And that was keep our employees safe, keep them calm, and make sure they're trusting leadership with the idea that credibility is everything in a time like this. So we set up a daily crisis management team meeting, a group. That group that I lead meets every day right at middle of the day. We have a weekly communication cadence, a video and a written communication that's going out every week to our employees, addressing key topics, status of the company, changes that are occurring, what are the communication plans, and then every 2 weeks, the top 60 people in the company, we meet every 2 weeks on this kind of forum as it's just an opportunity for them to ask me any question they have or express any concerns they have. The best news I have is we're getting good feedback from our customers. Just yesterday, I received a note from a CEO of someone who's buying our product and indicating that they're really pleased with how it's going. And I really see that as just a reflection of if your employees feel comfortable and they're calm about where they're at in the whole process, I believe they convey that confidence to others. The key learnings or observations is first of all, I want to say is this has been a very difficult crisis management to work through relative to many others that maybe somebody has had an experience in, and I can say for myself. What made this one really challenging for a manufacturing company was there were all these different work restrictions being put in place around the globe. And even in the case, and just use a few cases in the US, you could have a work restriction conditions by state, by city, and by county, and they wouldn't all be the same.
Yeah.
And that just caused all kinds of anxiety and uncertainty and things like that. So keeping employees calm during this was really, really important. Another observation that I'm hearing from a lot of my peer group is, and we definitely would reflect this, is the work from home, in essence, our office workers that are now working from home, it's gone better than expected. It's gone actually extremely well from that standpoint. The positive side that I would say has come out of this is, given all the challenges, I can say, and this is just opinion, our company has improved more in the last 6 weeks than any other 6-week time frame since I've been here. It's just been a tremendous opportunity to see where any vulnerabilities or weaknesses that you have, they become more pronounced in this environment, and you're really able to see them and then start putting plans in place to address them. But on an overall basis, I have to say I'm really pleased with how the organization has responded to the challenges, and we're pushing a theme, and the theme in our organization is we need to be playing to win, not a hunker down strategy, which a lot of people are talking about, and that's really resonated with our organization very well.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and that's really good context. And yeah, I think a lot of leaders share that notion that work from home has gone particularly well, all things considered. I guess shifting the discussion into the topic of infrastructure. Norm, you guys have put a lot of thought leadership out there as far as where we are. And relative to historical. So if you wouldn't mind just giving us context for things today as far as U.S. infrastructure goes and the spending and the perception of it.
Great. And Tim, I just wanted to echo what you said, the idea that you're playing to win and not hunkering down. I'm reading a lot of George Patton these days, and that's what Patton was all about: move fast and save lives.
Yeah.
That's a really good introduction to what I'm talking about. If you look at where we are right now, and if you look at the state of U.S. infrastructure, we only invest about 1.3% of GDP in our infrastructure, Jose, and we've, historically invested 3 to 4% of GDP. So you've got a deficit, and it's also a sustained deficit. Over the last 40 years, our investment in infrastructure has declined. Plus, the other big problem, is that our infrastructure is now old, average age 55 to 60 years. And then the third issue, which is critical to most of our thinking, is that there's a lot of technology that's going into infrastructure. And it's not just 5G and driverless vehicles. There's a huge amount of digitization that's going into infrastructure, and that's what makes economies productive. And then the other thing that we see as a way to frame this discussion is that, we've been the consumption economy. It's almost as if to be a patriot, you have to consume, right? You have to go buy, I don't know, a couple of shirts a week or something, because if you consume, you're driving the global economy forward. That's not going to happen in the future. Huge amount of debt, right? So we're going to turn into a savings and investment economy. We think that's good for infrastructure. We think that's really important for infrastructure. Another trend that I think is absolutely critical is this nearshoring piece of the business, right? Where we bring our supply chains, my goodness, for health, for almost everything we're talking about in terms of technology, in terms of defense. We've got a project with the people across the street looking at strategic minerals. We bring that supply chain home. That's incredibly complex, and that's going to drive huge demand for infrastructure in the US, in Mexico, and in Canada, and probably in the Americas in general. So from our point of view, there's a huge pent-up demand. There's a huge opportunity. We're very concerned about, and we can get into this in a minute, but we're very concerned about the people on Capitol Hill getting along. We're very concerned about how they get along with the White House and whether we actually get the kind of infrastructure stimulus that we need, that we not just need, but desperately need.
Yeah. And to that end, where are we in terms of the consumer's perception of where we are in infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it's a really interesting question. We've been, since the crisis started, one of the things we've been doing to stay in touch with our clients, and we have a database of about 60,000 infrastructure executives around the world. We have an initiative called Blueprint 2025 that's really focused on doubling the level of U.S. infrastructure investment. We did 2 surveys. We've done 4 surveys, 2 global surveys, 2 U.S. surveys. In the last global survey, one of the questions we asked was around the infrastructure brand, because if you think about it, and if you think about some of Tim's challenges and the challenge of the U.S. Economy as well, we need to recover, but the global economy needs to recover. The Europeans are not in great shape, but emerging markets are going to be hit very hard by COVID. And what we found was that in emerging markets, about 84% of respondents, and these are people from the infrastructure industry, say that the infrastructure brand is either mediocre or weak. But what we found, which was extraordinary, is in the US, it's 94% of respondents said the brand is either mediocre or weak. So we're trying to get people organized around making major investments in infrastructure. And it's basically saying, why don't you buy brand X, which you've had a really bad experience with, right? So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done around building up people's appreciation of the industry. And one of the problems is obviously that people don't know what it is. So maybe it's highways, roads, and bridges. Maybe it's when we do surveys, it's not highways, roads, and bridges. It's not airports. It's health. So that means water. And it's mobility. So that means the kind of things that Tim does, but safety, but moving people faster so people have better lives. That's how people think about infrastructure.
Yeah. And Tim, any kind of data as far as the customers you primarily deal with, which is on the road safety side and road repairs?
Well, if you look at it a little higher level than that, just say the states here recently have requested Congress to infuse roughly $550 billion in a 4th stimulus package. $50 billion of that is targeted towards transportation. So the House Democrats are expected to introduce an economic stimulus in the coming weeks here that could exceed as much as $1 trillion is what we're picking up. So that's going to obviously address a lot of the state budget concerns and infrastructure needs. The Senate's going to be forced to respond to these states' requests. From our standpoint, obviously, if any of that investment is made, we feel we're in a good position with our portfolio, whether it's road safety products or road zipper, to be able to participate in many of those projects.
Excellent. Norm, in touching on what you said about Blueprint 2025, there are obviously plans that even the president has discussed and that Congress is laying out there. Where do we stand as far as plans that are out there, and maybe discuss some of yours that you've put forward?
Sure. And going back to Tim just briefly, one of the things that I'm concerned about, Tim, because you've heard forever about big time infrastructure investments. I mean, since 2015, we've heard about $2 trillion, and none of that's happened. But we've heard the same words since the Clinton election in 1993 that we're behind in terms of infrastructure. And one of my concerns, I'll get to our plan in a second, Jose, but one of my concerns is that time goes pretty fast. And we've got a crisis right now, and it's a big crisis. And I think a very significant infrastructure stimulus has to happen, but it has to happen quickly. If it doesn't happen quickly, we move into election season where Nancy Pelosi is not going to give $1 trillion or $2 trillion to Donald Trump. That's not going to happen the closer we get to the election. We need that. We need this in this next stimulus. And there's a lot of debate inside the Congress, even among the Democrats, about what they want in terms of a stimulus. And of course, Mitch McConnell says, no more debt. But what we're looking at, Jose, is to try to bring this down to the level of human beings, voters, people with voices, and companies like Tim's that are people who create jobs, need to maintain jobs. So what we've done is we've looked at every single project that we could identify in the US, working with industry, that will create jobs, that will put shovels in the ground starting June 1st. And we came up with about 480 projects. It's a little over $1 billion in terms of it, a little over $1 billion in terms of, it's a little over $1 trillion in terms of infrastructure investment. These are 4 or 5 year investments, but it's over $1 trillion. And it would create as many as 2.2 million jobs. That sounds fantastic, but if you think about it, we've just lost 30 million jobs. Creating 2.2 would be a way to not just restart our economy, but give people an injection of confidence, right? So we think it's absolutely critical that we do that. But I'm sitting in Washington, I talk to these guys all the time, and it's 50-50 at best that we'll actually have an infrastructure stimulus. That's one of the things that I'm really worried about.
Norman, Jose, if I can just jump in, I share your view. I will tell you the one thing that I think is different, though, is if you go back over the last couple of years, our position publicly had been, we didn't expect, and we used the phrase, a big bang.
Right.
It was going to be more piecemeal. I think there's an opportunity here, greater odds than it's ever been, and that's a U.S. message. And I think if you go globally, from our standpoint at least, we think there will be more money invested in infrastructure over the next 18, 24 months than historically any plans were in place to do so. So I do think there'll be a lift. How big, to be determined.
Right. Okay. And one message, just to go back, Tim, is that my message to you is that it has to come from you guys. It has to come from the governors. They have to make it very clear to the people on Capitol Hill and the president that we have to have an infrastructure stimulus. You don't get to not do it one more time.
Yeah, no, I would agree.
Yeah. Norm, how do you motivate private capital to invest in this? And I think the plan that you guys have laid out is basically 50-50 ultimately. So how do you motivate private outcomes?
Yeah, I think there's this sort of Larry Summers school that debt will never harm the economy, right? 30 trillion, 40 trillion, as long as there's cash flow to service the debt, everything's wonderful. We're worried about the amount of money debt we're going to leave to our children and grandchildren, right? It's a lot of money right now. So we're really focused on the fact that the country has $27 trillion in institutional funds, pension funds, life insurance money. And you've really got to start to focus on how to channel that money into really good infrastructure projects. That's the challenge that we face. And I do think 50-50 is a good way to look at it. That would get us up to 2.3%, maybe even 3% of GDP invested in infrastructure. But you've got to make it, you're going to have to do serious alterations in terms of how Washington works. One of the things, if you think about it, Jose and Tim, we're talking about infrastructure, but there's no infrastructure budget in the US government. There's no Department of Infrastructure. There's nobody in charge of infrastructure in the White House, right? So there's a lot of, that's ridiculous. There's a lot of work that needs to be done before we're going to be able to really channel significant funds into infrastructure in a way that works. Because the other thing that's absolutely critical is that we don't make the same mistakes that we made during the 2009 stimulus, where we ended up doing shovel-ready sidewalks and shovel-ready bike paths and essentially left the country with more debt than it had. this stimulus needs to leave us with real assets that make our economy productive going into the next 10 or 20 years. Because this period right now is it's critical, right? And I'm not sure, I like Tim because we just met, but I'm not sure I agree with Tim about the global stimulus. My concern, Tim, globally is that these economies are so weak and their healthcare systems are so weak and their level of debt's so significant already that unless the first world, World Bank, et cetera, make a big decision about an infrastructure stimulus for those guys, they're going to be moving along slowly for the next 5 or 6 years. You know, we're already talking about a lost decade for Latin America. That's huge, right? And if you look at the countries in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, you know, the story's already there. And a place like Peru is being ravaged by COVID. So, you know, I think part of my job is to wake people up to non-positive events. And I think one of the things we have is a real challenge on our border.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt what you're saying is going to be a dynamic in those countries. But we are seeing places like Western Europe where there has been some investment that would not have occurred as a result of this. But I want to come back on what you just said and see if we're seeing the world the same on this whole public-private partnership. It has been small, but we are seeing an increased motivation and really coming from the states. We're picking up, there's about 10 states that want to move more in this direction. So you're coming from a small base, but our view is there is an increasing desire to go this direction.
So, you know, if I can answer that, is that okay, Jose?
Yeah, of course.
It's probably one of the questions that your folks are going to ask anyway. Look, on the public-private partnership piece of this, we need to figure out how to get increased money quickly into infrastructure projects, right? PPPs don't do that, right? The average, it takes 2 to 3 years in terms of the legal structuring, et cetera. And we need to move fast. So I think one of the things I would argue is that there's a whole range of ways to do that. I actually have a paper where we identified 8 different channels of getting private investment into infrastructure projects. PPPs is only one of them. And it takes longer, right? We did zero, I think we closed 0 PPPs in the US last year. Only 8 were closed in all of Latin America. But there's a huge amount of money that needs to go into projects. And in our recent survey, people actually suggested that concessions were a much more effective way for them to get involved in infrastructure projects than PPPs. So, I mean, but not necessarily disagreeing with you, Tim, because PPPs is a sort of a weird general term of art that means different things to different people. But the sort of standard thing that let's say the Australians and the English have been trying to foist on us isn't exactly working very well. If we got 0 last year. So, and you know, it's based on the apportionment of risk, and risk is of course going to be giant going forward. And we need strategic silver bullets to get pension fund money into the right projects that are going to create value for a long time.
Yeah. And just working back on some of the math that you gave, Norm, as far as the 2.2 million jobs, how do you kind of derive that number in your plan? And, you know, obviously a big selling point to officials out there as far as, you know, jobs.
Yeah, so we've been doing this for a long time. You know, the World Bank will say that every $1 billion invested in infrastructure, an infrastructure project yields 15,000 jobs and 2 to 3 times as many indirect jobs. Direct jobs is 15,000. That's a ridiculous figure, right? That's like the pharaohs in the pyramids didn't employ that many people. So what we've been doing is looking at different kinds of projects, highway projects, bridge projects, transit projects, water projects, and coming up with rules of thumb. We've put those into algorithms. And then we work with the planners and the engineers to make sure that we're right. So all the projects that we identified for you, they actually have a direct and indirect job number attached to them. And we've also put those on a map. I can share with you all the map. It's super password protected because we don't need anybody causing us problems in our sandbox. But what's really interesting about this map is it then has 480 projects that are ready to go. And it gives you exactly, you know, where they are, what they're going to do, the amount of money that needs to be invested in each one, and the jobs, direct and indirect, that each will create. And then what we've also done is overlaying that with where the jobs where the workers come from, and then where manufacturing jobs, like Tim's jobs, would be created, manufacturing clusters around the US. And if you do that with those 480 jobs, you create jobs in every single congressional district. And that's the tool we want to use to make sure that Capitol Hill this time actually responds to the necessity, and pretty brutal necessity, of a strong infrastructure stimulus. I mean, you got to go big, right? This has to be, as Tim said, this has to be a big bang, right? Without a big bang, we're 3 to 4 years into the recovery, just like we took 3 to 4 years to recover after the 1918 pandemic.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think that's one of the big criticisms on kind of broad-reaching infrastructure bills, period.
Right.
I wanted to turn over and see if there were any Q&A from the audience. Chris, I don't know if there's anything.
Yeah, we don't have any in there at the moment, but as a reminder, you can enter the Q&A with the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, I guess the big thing that maybe people want to take away is kind of the probabilities of success in the short term here. We talked a little bit about maybe the fourth stimulus, but I guess if each of you wouldn't mind just going through what you think will happen here in 2020 as far as this debate goes and real push forward.
Please go ahead, Tim, if you like, and then I'll follow up.
Well, from a Lindsay standpoint, two key things have changed in our portfolio over the last year, which is due to MASH, we've had a new update, refreshment of our road safety portfolio. And the second is on Road Zipper, we implemented what we refer to as the shift left, which is a way of saying that we're getting more involved at the planning and design stage of a project, as opposed to waiting until the problem is already in place. We are looking at this as an environment where I would say the probability of an increased amount of money being spent on investment is higher today than it was a couple of years ago. I feel real good that we're positioned to be able to participate in that increased investment. So we've got the best road safety portfolio we've ever had as a result of this refresh that's happened through MASH. And then Road Zipper, we've had a couple large projects here just recently, one in the UK that was announced, which is this shift left. I think that fits extremely well in an environment if this increased infrastructure spend occurs. So that's our position and how we want to go forward with this.
That's great. Jose, I saw you have a couple of questions. Do you want to go to those, or would you like us to wrap it up?
We can, I guess, comment on this. There's one here that says, comment on the educational infrastructure and where that fits in. Obviously, that's been a big change.
Well, that's a gigantic question, right? I mean, one of the things that we think is that social infrastructure is where private money ought to be able to go pretty quickly. And there's a huge opportunity, both in terms of hospitals and in terms of educational facilities, to get private investment into those assets. So, my answer is, when I talk about infrastructure, I'm talking about transport, energy, I'm talking about water. We're talking about anything having to do with 5G, including smart cities. And by the way, cities not just creating data, but actually monetizing data as a way to generate revenue to invest in additional infrastructure. So I think that's really important. And the social infrastructure piece is absolutely key here. And I think what we're going to do is see a huge amount of investment, not just in hospital and healthcare infrastructure going forward, all the pent-up investment that we probably didn't make over the last 10 years, but we'll see the same kind of thing in education. But I also tend to think that the educational system has just got a giant wake-up call, and it, we're looking at a very different kind of education system going forward, probably with a lot more technology, a lot more one-on-one teaching, less big classes, et cetera. So I think there's a big change there.
Tim, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I would bring it down to our company, the whole work from home and then how you interact with your customers has obviously changed a lot. How we're able to now take that into our training programs and cascade that information. There's some real learnings that have come out of here. And to me, one of the biggest things for Lindsay, and I think this is probably characteristic of a lot of companies, a lot more confidence in the use of technology to be able to do that effectively, as opposed to the traditional bring everybody in to one site and try to do the education or training at that point. So this is going to change a lot of our interactions with our customers, especially in the area of training and on the educational side.
Yeah, that's great.
Perfect.
So, so if you want, I can quickly do my summary. Is that okay, or would you?
Sure.
No, I just wanted
real quick.
I wanted to add the part. This is something we haven't seen anything like this in 100 years, and so I do think that the next month or so are critical in terms of public decision making. We need to get this right. We're still focused on testing. We're still focused on contact tracing, et cetera. We need teams of people to do that, but we really do need the people in Congress and people in the White House to shift focus to a very quick, very abrupt economic recovery. It has to be robust. It has to be quick. That's what I'm worried about, because I think that people like Tim who are creating jobs and maintaining jobs, they deserve fantastic leadership from their public officials, and we just all of us have to get together to make that happen.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys very much. We've hit our half hour, so appreciate it, and thanks so much. I guess now we'll turn it over to my colleague Mac Sykes. Mac has been with Gabelli for over 10 years and responsible for our coverage of financial institutions. He and Chris Bloomstrand will go over Berkshire Hathaway. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jose.